collapse of Iceland's banks last autumn created uncertainty for millions of UK savers who had billions of pounds tied up in their British subsidiaries. But could all those worries have been avoided? Channel 4 News has learnt that when Iceland's biggest bank, Kaupthing, bought the British bank Singer and Friedlander, its chief executive told the regulators he thought the deal shouldn't go through. He'll share his concerns with a committee of MPs tomorrow, but his intervention has raised fresh questions about whether regulation of the banks in Britain was tough enough. Here's our business correspondent, Siobhan Kennedy.
The story of Naomi House Children's Hospice highlighted the human cost behind the collapse of Iceland's banking system. The charity had £5.7 million of savings invested in Kaupthing, Singer and Friedlander, the UK arm of Iceland's biggest bank, which was shut down last autumn. As the hospice waits to hear if it will get any of its money back, questions are now being asked as to whether the UK's regulatory authorities should have allowed the Icelandic bank to expand so much in Britain. Back in 2005, Kaupthing was one of Iceland's fastest growing banks and saw an opportunity to gain a foothold in London with the takeover of Singer and Friedlander, one of the city's oldest merchant banks. It now turns out that at the time, the British chief executive of Singer and Friedlander himself had doubts about Kaupthing and the takeover and raised these to the city watchdog, the Financial Services Authority, but was not heeded. According to his evidence seen by Channel 4 News, Tony Shearer, the head of Singer and Friedlander, will tomorrow tell the Treasury Select Committee,
"My short experience of Kaupthing and its management lead me to believe that they were not fit and proper people to control a UK bank. This view is shared by most, if not all, of the other members of the Singer and Friedlander board. Accordingly, I called the FSA and passed on my views to them."
When Mr Shearer gives his evidence here tomorrow in front of the Treasury Select Committee, he will touch on one of the central points of the banking crisis, whether or not Britain's regulatory system was robust enough to cope. In a previous session here last year, the head of the city watchdog, the Financial Services Authority, admitted that the regulator had failed to spot the problems brewing at Northern Rock early enough, but he insisted this was its only regulatory failure. Now it turns out that might not be the case.
They have a responsibility, and a very important responsibility, to ensure that anyone takes over a bank in this country are fit and proper people. And we now know that the people who ran Kaupthing, indeed most of the Icelandic financial establishment, were not fit and proper people to run a fish and chip shop, never mind a bank.
It's not just charities that got burnt. Thousands of Britons who chose to invest in Kaupthing's Isle of Man subsidiary because it had higher interest rates are still waiting to hear if they'll get their money back.
I'm lucky, I'm young enough, hopefully, to actually be able to get myself back on my feet again and make something of myself again. A lot of our depositors aren't in that position. These are people in their 50s, 60s, 70s, even into their 80s and 90s, who have lost their entire life savings. And they're absolutely destitute. They've got absolutely nothing left.
Mr Shearer said he was concerned about Kaupthing buying the British bank for two main reasons. Firstly, the quality of Kaupthing's management, and secondly, the quality of the Icelandic bank's profits.
I believe that the FSA had sufficient information about Kaupthing that they should never have approved the change of control, and if they were to do so, they should have made extensive further inquiries.
Tonight, the FSA told Channel 4 News that it always investigates these types of city takeovers and that it only approves them if it is satisfied that its requirements will be met. It said it did not believe the statements due to be made tomorrow to the Treasury Select Committee represented an accurate summary of the events.
Well, joining me now is the former head of the international policy at the Financial Services Authority, David Green, and I'm grateful to you for dropping in, obviously on your way to a formal dinner. Do you think the FSA failed over Kaupthing and will have to acknowledge that Kaupthing was also a regulatory failure?
I can't comment on the facts of the case, and indeed the facts aren't known and aren't knowable at this stage. I think it's important in the case of these Icelandic banks to distinguish between two sets of circumstances. There were the branches of those banks which were effectively outside the FSA's jurisdiction as part of the European arrangements. That's something that's being looked at. Then there are subsidiaries of European banks where, as we've already been told, the FSA is responsible for assessing the fitness and properness of the owners of a bank. However, that's not the whole story. What the FSA has to do is to reach a judgment about what's in the best interests of the depositors.
So it may have to ignore the warnings of a chief executive,
well,
as it appears to in this instance, for some greater goal.
Well, again, I say I can't comment on the facts of this particular case.
Why
but
not?
it has to.
Because you weren't there at the time.
Because I wasn't there at the time, and we don't know what evidence the FSA took into account. What the FSA always has to do in cases like this is reach a judgment about what's in the best interests of the creditors, taking account of the circumstances at the time. We don't know what the circumstances were of Singer and Friedler at the time. The condition of the Icelandic banks was different at that time. The FSA also has various remedies that it can put in place in relation to subsidiaries, but it has to balance all those things.
What would have happened in the scenario that you have a very senior banker? This isn't just sort of any old person in the city. This is the chief executive of a long-established merchant bank raising very serious concerns with somebody or some people in the FSA. Would those concerns be widely circulated in the FSA, or would they, as a matter of course, or could that have easily been kept isolated and fallen through the net?
The FSA, I'm sure, will always look at concerns of this kind, but they will need to give thought to what else was happening in the bank and what the other alternatives were for the future of that bank, the bank at the time.
This could mean compensation, couldn't it, though, if the FSA are found to have been at fault?
We don't know yet at all what the circumstances of the case are. In relation to depositors in banks, of course, there already is the Deposit Protection Scheme. In case of investors associated with investment funds run by Singer and Friedlander, there's the Investors Compensation Scheme. So I think we have to wait and see what the facts eventually tell us.
David Green, thank you very much.